one of the reasons that people become writers and artists is that they are refining the very best part of themselves, sort of lifting themselves out of the ordinary aspect of their personalities. I'll give you an example. There's nobody more flawed as a person than Ernest Hemingway. I think he understood that. He was not really a nice person. He could be generous, but he wasn't really a nice person. William Faulkner was also very flawed. Robert Frost was flawed. Dostoevsky, you could sort of name these people, not all of them, men, of course, very, very flawed people. Nonetheless, by working extremely hard, by calibrating what they were doing formally, it's like they lifted themselves out of that morass of terrible imperfection and created abiding works of art that outlive them and are beautiful.
Hello, this is Robinson Erhardt, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 214. And this episode is with Joyce Carol Oates, who is the Rogers S. Berlin 52 Professor Emerita in the Humanities at Princeton University with the program in creative writing. Joyce is another character who doesn't need to be introduced, but will of course get an introduction anyway, as she's among my favorite authors, among the most widely recognized writers in the world, and also equally important, a friend to house cats everywhere, and probably cats not in houses too. In our last conversation, which was episode 137, we talked about craft in fiction and poetry, but this conversation was distinctly more philosophical. The focus is, speaking of house cats, we have an intruder, the podcat, but the focus of the episode is her short story collection, Zero Sum, which came out quite recently and which I loved. And the stories grapple with a lot of issues in applied ethics and other areas in philosophy. We talk about her colleague at Princeton, Peter Singer, Buddhism, Joyce's formalist philosophy of literature, Borges, Hemingway, translation, and all sorts of other things. There are links to Zero Sum, Joyce's Twitter, and also her Substack in the description. Other things worth noting are the Patreon for the show, a link to which is also in the description, and the link to which you might be interested in following if you are interested in show notes or an ad-free RSS feed for the show, or just supporting this podcast. But now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Joyce. Today, as you know, I really want to talk about philosophy and literature, and more particularly as it relates to your recent short story collection, Zero Sum, which I think you might have at the moment. Yes. Okay, beautiful. It's got the Magritte cover that I wanted to ask about at some point. But I thought a nice place to begin would actually be with a recent guest on my show, since his work connects to a lot of the themes in your book. I mean, abortion, suicide, climate change, animal welfare, and other questions of quote unquote practical ethics. And of course, I have in mind your Princeton colleague, Peter Singer. So how well do you know Peter?
Well, I've known Peter for quite a while, really ever since he came to Princeton, which I think was 1999 or somewhere just around that time. Peter was immediately a controversial figure. There was a good deal of discussion about him even being invited to be on the faculty. But we had a very forward-looking, wonderful administration, so he had a good deal of support. And I think I met him through Amy Gutman, who subsequently went on to be president of the University of Pennsylvania. Amy was the head of the Center for Human Values, which was just recently established. And that's interdisciplinary. So I guess I represented the creative writing faculty, and there were many people there from philosophy and politics and history and so forth.
Well, I read the really sweet remarks that you gave at his retirement, and it is quite clear that you really admire his philosophical work. But more particularly, I was wondering if you identify as a utilitarian in the way that he does, or if it's more that you just empathize with a lot of his attitudes towards animal welfare and that sort of thing, or just how you think about how his work relates to you.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think that the essence of my own personality, and maybe many writers and artists, so I'm really sort of a formalist, and I'm interested in the dramatic interplay of ideas. I'm interested in human personality and the forms of art in which we can express them. So I would say that utilitarianism or American pragmatism, with which I feel more the kinship of William James, and, the essential American philosophy, I think, is pragmatism. Utilitarianism I associate with England. To me, that's an idea. And I think it's a very logical and sensible idea, but like all ideas, it has flaws and has limits. But I'm also attracted to sort of a contrary idea that there are absolutes and there are truths that are irrevocable. Pragmatism and utilitarianism are sort of like plastic. They're prehensile. They're a philosophy for being in the world, almost literally in the world, like politically, where you're concerned with reform in society. But the contrary to that would be a philosophy or a way of life that's not necessarily in the world, the daily world, but rather a transcendental vision that cuts across history and epochs and cultures. So utilitarianism to me is an idea. And then the contrary idea, each would be more Platonic or Kantian, that's also an idea. So I sort of see these ideas as being in play. That's why I'm drawn to philosophy.
I want to focus on what you said about formalism and your being a formalist, and the idea that you're interested in personality and the forms of art in which we can express them, because your characters express very different views about things than I think you do, or at least some of them. So with regard to Peter's work, I mean, Peter is one of the world's best known vegetarians. And I have in mind two characters when I think about vegetarians that you have written about or from the perspective of. And your favorite, my favorite book of yours, The Accursed, you write from the perspective of Upton Sinclair, the famed author of The Jungle. And there's this one really amazing scene. I read the book well over a year ago now, but I think he's in a bar in New York City, and there's just this long passage where he's just really disgusted by meat eating. And then in Zero Sum, there's a story called The Suicide. And an episode in this story that really stuck out at me is the main character doesn't really care about animals at all, but he runs over a fox and is sort of very excited that he's feeling about it emotionally. And I'm wondering if one of the ways that literature connects to philosophy for you is that you're able to explore all of these different lines of inquiry and angles about specific philosophical issues, and then maybe you find out in doing so which positions resonate most with you.
Well, again, I don't really know that would be high value for me. Like if I have a certain opinion about something politically, or whether I like Indian food or Chinese food or French food, that's sort of superficial. I think what's more profound, because it's almost indefinable, is the interplay, the kind of drama of all these ideas and the sort of suspension. Shakespeare was drawn to this phenomenon also. One can deduce from some of his plays some ideas that seem consistent in Shakespeare, like the idea of a hierarchy. He's not an egalitarian or a Democrat, but that's sort of irrelevant. It's really the sort of incandescent, radiant, extraordinary, fantastic interplay of drama in human lives. I think that is, to me, utterly fascinating. So I try to find ways to dramatize that. Obviously, I have to use language, so I'm limited by language. If I were a filmmaker or a musician or a composer, I would probably, try something else. But the story about the suicide is basically an exploration of that particular point of view, that this person who is based on an actual writer, that person is locked into his identity. He can't seem to get free of that identity. He can't even commit suicide because he can't write the perfect suicide note. Whatever he writes is not good enough. He's a perfectionist, so he's somewhat paralyzed. So he's driving his car. He's always thinking that he really should be committing suicide, but he keeps putting it off, and he can't do it right, or he can't write the right note, and it's all this sort of comic stuff. But then he hits a fox on the highway, and immediately he forgets all about this stuff in his head. He wants to help the animal. He takes the animal to the rescue center, and he's concerned with the animal. And I thought that is so true of all of our lives. We can be locked up in our heads and all this very claustrophobic and solipsistic dramas going on. Then something happens in the world like an emergency, and you forget about all that, and you rush out to do something that could be considered a good deed, which could be heroic, but it connects you to other people. And so I think I'm always looking for that to write about, because I know that is a real human experience. And I think those of us who live with animals have this experience a lot. You can be locked up in your own thoughts, and then the animal intrudes, or, the animal wants to be fed, or something has happened to the animal, and we immediately forget about ourselves.
One of the interesting things about Peter is that, and I think you remarked on this in your notes at his retirement, and he mentioned it in our conversation as well, that he doesn't particularly like animals at all. He's just a very principled person, which I find quite funny.
Well, he's a utilitarian, and he's also something of a Buddhist. Now, he doesn't talk about Buddhism at all, I will say. But
well, he actually has a joint book with a Buddhist.
Oh, okay, but I'm wrong about that. But
it's recent.
I haven't heard him talk about it, this conversation. But obviously, his ethical views coincide with Buddhism. So the essence of Buddhism is that we should try to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings, not just people, not just people who look like us, but animals as well. It's a form of sort of a subset of utilitarianism, where the greatest good for the greatest number, or the least pain for the most people. It's essential to a reformist agenda. You have to reform society, you have to look upon anybody as equal. And you have to try to alleviate suffering in everyone. So that's the form of utilitarianism that definitely overlaps with Buddhism.
Is this something that resonates with you as well, that we have a moral obligation of some sort to alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings?
Well, I think that's a real ideal. I think that Buddhism, there are Buddhists maybe along a spectrum, some are more active politically. It isn't exactly religion, it's sort of just a philosophy or a way of life, a vision of life. But Buddhism, as I understand it, arises from a set of circumstances in which individuals feel very powerless. In other words, it doesn't arise out of an act of democracy. Say you're in a philosophy department and it's 35 people, you all have one vote, and you can all openly discuss what you're going to do, and you have that self-democracy. There's no reason that any individual in that group would feel passive or fatalistic or resigned to fate, because it's a different consciousness. Now, the way of the Tao, the way of Eastern religions generally, has been extreme passivity, and the agenda or the challenge is how to accept it. So Buddhism teaches not to be attached to anything, not attached to your desires, and really not to have any desires, almost as if you're already posthumous. But that's not really a philosophy for, let's say, the United States. So say 19th century America is much more, as I was saying, William James's philosophy of activism, utilitarianism, practical pragmatism, that's a philosophy for a young nation, for younger people. We have much more autonomy. So I hope you can understand that I don't value one of these ideas over the other, but I think that they are relevant to their different places. I don't believe, the way I guess Plato seemed to pretend to believe, or maybe Kant, I don't believe that there's an essential self or consciousness that's ahistorical. To me, everything has to be actually regional. It's specific. We are speaking a certain language. We are speaking in a dialect of that language. We're not speaking the language of China, or medieval Japan. We're not speaking those languages. Our consciousness is very different. Are you a Kantian, or are you more of a pragmatic William Jamesian? I'm just curious how you define yourself.
I would definitely not describe myself as a Kantian, and I would definitely describe myself as more pragmatic in nature.
Well, I think that it makes a lot of sense, for America and for people like us. I think that people become much more fatalistic when they're boxed in somewhere. If you have no vote, if you don't even own any property, if you're really, really poor, there may be a philosophy like Hinduism or Buddhism or Christianity, the sort of original Christianity, which Nietzsche called a slave religion. Those religions are ways of life would be helpful to you because they teach you how to be resigned. That's why the American slave holders, we didn't allow their slaves to learn how to read or write, nonetheless wanted them to be Christians. And so their religion was encouraging, because Christianity is supposed to be a religion of acceptance through Jesus. In other words, you don't care about the material world, you care about being saved. And so that's a good example of how Christianity was used, maybe unwittingly, maybe unconsciously, sort of used by a social or oppressive social establishment, using a religion to keep their workers, their enslaved workers, quiet and awesome.
Just as an aside, listening to you speak about Buddhism or reflecting on all of the research about turn of the, I think you'd say 19th century, maybe 20th century Princeton that you had to do for The Accursed, or even the extent to which you're engrossed in the philosophy of language and the titular story of Zero Sum, it makes me wonder how research functions in your writing. Do you know as much as you know about Buddhism because you've written about it or written from the perspective of a Buddhist in a story, or is it just something that you've collected because of your interest in philosophy?
So I think maybe all of those possibilities. I do a lot of reading, and I'm very capable of just getting lost and reading something for, I need to do something else, but then I spend 40 minutes reading something that I had not intended to read. And so I sort of accumulate a lot. It's like a vacuum cleaner moving around the world, sort of drawing all this stuff into my head. I don't use most of it. It's just part of life. It's like listening to music. You're sort of listening to music, and then you're listening to some other music, and then you listen to something else. And there's not any clear purpose to what you're doing. If you're trying to work, it's almost counterproductive. But so Buddhism is something that I did study. At one point, I already did a course in it. But just generally, we pick these things up in the world. It's such a beautiful religion or philosophy, I'm not sure what you would call it, because it is a philosophy for people who are not so ambulatory and, not so young. It's a religion for people who need to seriously think about giving up their attachments to the world. Most people are not in any position to think about that. When I think about my attachments to the world, they are thick as glue. I'm just, just trying to deceive myself if I feel that intellectually I'm sort of detached from all these dependencies that I have. One of the reasons that people become writers and artists is that they are refining the very best part of themselves, sort of lifting themselves out of the ordinary aspect of their personalities. I'll give you an example. There's nobody more flawed as a person than Ernest Hemingway. I think he understood that. He was not really a nice person. He could be generous, but he wasn't really a nice person. William Faulkner was also very flawed. Robert Frost was flawed. Dostoevsky, you could sort of name these people, not all of them, men, of course, very, very flawed people. Nonetheless, by working extremely hard, by calibrating what they were doing formally, it's like they lifted themselves out of that morass of terrible imperfection and created abiding works of art that outlive them and are beautiful. Some of Ernest Hemingway's short stories are like carefully cut gems. They are extremely beautiful. But if you trace them back to the person who wrote them, you'd probably be surprised. So all writers, including myself, are trying to do that all the time. They're trying to step up a ladder and get to a higher point. Do something that's not weighted down with trivial things and this, attachments of different kinds. Poets are trying to do that. It's a whole subject in itself. Philosophers, I would think, even more than most people, have always tried to present a purely intellectual consciousness that's not a full human being. Like Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And all around Descartes is this unacknowledged world of people doing things for him, probably women, changing his bed linen, giving him food, cleaning up after him. Well, the whole circumstantial world that surrounds us is completely ignored or refuted by a philosophy. So as a novelist, I look upon that with a kind of amusement.
One thing that, since you bring up Hemingway, and you also mentioned that the suicide is based on an actual writer, is there any connection there at all?
Connection between who?
Between Hemingway and the suicide.
Oh, I actually have a story. I have a long story about Hemingway, the last day of his life. I have a collection of stories about the final days in the lives of great American classic writings. Emily Dickinson is one, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman. I think I have a Thoreau. I do have a Robert Frost. It's not in that collection, but I definitely have a Hemingway, Mark Twain. So it's called Wild Nights. And Hemingway is the last story in the volume. I was just fascinated by how he felt driven to kill himself, take his own life. It's a whole drama. And if you understand Hemingway, you understand how inevitable it was for him. At the same time, it was a consequence of his being locked into a certain personality.
In the suicide, you just said that he couldn't actually write the suicide note, but there were a couple of other very funny to me reasons why he couldn't commit suicide. Oh, there's Zanch. Hi, Zanch. And the two were, he was terrified that, unbeknownst to him, a terrible review of his book would come out, or some of his other writings, right around the time he committed suicide, and then people would speculate that it was because of that. And then the alternative was that around the same time he would commit suicide, unbeknownst to him, one of his books had been sold to Hollywood for $100 million. There's this catch-22 preventing his suicide. But this made me wonder, because also in your remarks about Peter Singer, when you first met him or you went to one of his early lectures, there was a heckler, and he just dealt with the criticism very well because he was used to this. I'm wondering how it is that you deal with criticism and bad reviews of your own writing, and how that might have changed over the years. And I'm partially asking this for selfish reasons, because I often get very negative comments and reviews on the podcast, and I have various ways of dealing with it.
Well, I think that's a good question. It also does relate, I think, to people's experience. You know, when you've gotten literally 11,000 reviews, some of them bad, it doesn't feel as important as it does when you're a new young writer. Say you're getting your first reviews for your first book. It's like it's like a tabula rasa, like it's all like a white wall, and some graffiti could be scrawled on it. But then after years, if you publish a lot, there's so much graffiti on the wall that you don't really see it anymore. Maybe it's more along the lines of what I was saying about Buddhism, that it is an appropriate philosophy for people who are older, who are sort of getting ready to detach themselves from worldly things. I mean, Hemingway did win a Nobel Prize. Most writers would say, well, I would love to win a Nobel Prize, I'll be happy the rest of my life. But that's not true, because Hemingway did win a Nobel Prize and he committed suicide not so long afterward. Camus won a Nobel Prize when he was quite young, and he lived very, very recklessly, almost as if he wanted to commit suicide, consequently. So I think that the goals and the values and the sensitivities that we have when we're younger just start to sort of fade away. Not necessarily because you're older, but because you've had experiences so many times.
Are there still people, at this point in your career, from whom you really welcome and accept criticism? Like friends like Margaret Atwood or editors or this sort of thing? Or at this point, are you just so comfortable with your writing and understanding of your own techniques and aptitudes that your writing is just exactly what you want it to be?
Oh, well, in some ways, that's a sort of a naive question, because a work of art, it could be music, it could be some, 12-tone music, or sort of unconventional sounds, or minimalist music, like Steve Reich or Philip Glass, in contrast to Mahler. If you have a vision that is your own, it could be, that it's uniquely your own, there's no real easy way that you would get rid of it. Like if somebody said to John Cage, that you should be taking music lessons and learn how to write like John Philip Sousa, let's say. Like John Cage, you're not commercial enough, or somebody should teach you how to write show business musicals for Broadway. It's just not even possible for anybody to take that, to assimilate that criticism. I mean, I would assume that Samuel Beckett was well aware that he wasn't writing like James Joyce, and he wasn't writing like Stendhal, and he wasn't writing like Cervantes, He was writing the way he had to write. He didn't really have a choice about it. So with my writing, I'm the only one who's responsible for it. People can always say, like in writing workshops, people say, I love it, don't change anything. But the writer herself thinks, no, this is not actually, it's not actually finished, I've almost always, when I bring together our collection of stories, I rewrite quite a few of the stories. I revise them. Sometimes I rewrite them so completely that I change the title. I rewrote one of my novels that was reprinted in the Modern Library. I rewrote about 80% of it. Somebody would say, well, Joyce, why are you doing that? You're not going to be paid anymore for it. There's almost no answer for that. So somebody like Margaret Atwood, who is a friend, or my late friend, Russell Bainix, they would never, ever, in a million years, no lie to them, write with some critical suggestion. We would never do anything like that. I mean, it's completely off the wall. The kind of people who offer suggestions, sometimes they're editors and they're in a context where they're supposed to offer suggestions. But no matter what the suggestions are, the writer has to be able to assimilate the ideas and use it in some positive way. And that's really it's not that easy.
That's a stark difference from philosophy, where, I mean, even the best philosophers in the world, I mean, the analogs of you and Margaret Atwood would send each other work for critical feedback and be expecting to hear or see in the journals very harsh takedowns of their own works from their friends.
Oh, that would never happen. I think that poets send one another work, and sometimes a poet may make some suggestion, but mostly the poets, we all respect one another. If you got some poetry from Robert Lowell and he said, tell me what you think about this, basically you're probably in awe of the fact that Robert Lowell wrote these poems. You can look at Melville's Moby Dick. Now, somebody would say, an enterprising young editor at Random House would say, this is a great fishing novel. Let's get rid of all these extra chapters and make it into something for a television series. Well, it's just insane to think that Melville would want any criticism like that, even though it made him a bestseller instead of a total failure, which is what, unfortunately, Moby Dick was.
Well, I think this is what I had in mind when I said that maybe you wouldn't require or want any criticism just because of the stage that you're in at your career and your prowess as a writer. Because I think one of the purposes of a creative writing teacher is to show the students or help the students discover or see what they don't know about their writing, things that they're doing that they're unaware of. But because the point you're at, you're aware of everything you're doing. You're far more aware than the reader. So that's why there isn't really room for the criticism.
Well, it is an interesting and it's a debatable issue. And I know that philosophers are in a community. Writers are just not quite like that. we have different voices, and the voices are what we were born into. And they change a little bit over time, but we really can't be somebody else. Paul Muldoon, my colleague and friend at Princeton, who writes very beautiful but difficult abstruse poetry, sometimes extremely inaccessible to most readers. Paul has said, he said, that's the way I write. I can't write any other way. And I find myself, with the kind of writing I'm doing now, my last several novels have given me so much trouble because I'm writing it in the historical present. I'm not writing a story that is like once upon a time, 1927, this happened. I'm writing something that's unfolding in real time. And I was reading André Gide on Chopin, Chopin's beautiful short piano pieces. And André Gide said that the beauty of Chopin, it should be played this way, is that it always feels like it's being improvised. It doesn't feel that Chopin wrote this whole so definite, really calculated composition and there's an end to it. But the music should be performed the way Chopin performed it, which is almost like little hesitations and sudden flurries, as if the music were arising out of some primordial spring of just great beauty and wonder, but there's not somebody who's calculating. And I find that so aesthetically attractive. I'm actually quite fascinated trying to do that. So I do have several novels. Babysitter was one of the more recent novels that's in the historical present. So that was imagined as a movie, because I feel that we're all sort of unmuting it in movies. They are opening before us and we don't know what the script is. We don't know what the next scene is. Like tomorrow morning, we have no ideas really what's going to be waiting for us. So it's as if we're characters in a movie. We're not directing the movie and we didn't write the screenplay. So I'm trying to communicate that sense of bewilderment and bafflement, sometimes dread, fear, anxiety, but also hopefulness and yearning and sense of adventure that we do feel in our lives. And that can't be captured by a past tense narrative, really. So I find that very hard to do. I mean, really hard to do. I can write 500 pages to get about 10 pages, and it's exhausting. So somebody might say, Joyce, why are you doing this? And I don't actually have an answer because I don't really want to do the easy thing that I did before. I want to do something difficult. It's a little like being on a tightrope without any net. So I don't want to write the kind of novels that I did write because they're in the past tense.
I apologize if I sort of misheard you or am misrepresenting what you said, but you mentioned something along the lines of you find it very aesthetically pleasing or ideal that the music should be played as Chopin wrote or intended it. And this raises a question that I've been thinking about for quite some time. So you wrote in The Suicide, I really loved this. You connected it to you had a connection to Borges, where just as the suicide, so the character's name is The Suicide. He can't write the actual suicide note, but he kind of thinks of himself as almost writing Borgesian fiction where he really is trying to commit suicide, but he just can't. And it's just very ironic. And something that I've often heard from Spanish speakers is that they just can't imagine reading Borges in English because it's so, it seems like it just has to be read in Spanish. And I wonder how you feel about your own work, for instance, being translated into these other languages, many other languages, I'm sure, in which you can't really verify or make sure that it has captured the spirit in which you wrote it and that the readers who are experiencing it in another language are getting what Joyce Carol Oates intended.
Well, I would think, to be realistic, a lot of it's lost. Frost said that poetry is what's lost in translation. But it's not realistic to think that anybody could replicate somebody else's voice. We know that Constance Garrett actually was improving Dostoevsky's prose. Evidently, I don't need Russian, but evidently Dostoevsky's prose was much more pedestrian, and his vocabulary wasn't as wide as his translators. So that's sort of the other side of it. But when you ask me how I feel about anything, I have, to be very honest, I have almost no feelings. Maybe because I've been writing so long, like as Flaubert said, this mania for sentences has dried up my heart. People are always asking me, how does it feel to be translated in 50 languages? Like, how does it feel to have won some award? Or how does it feel to see yourself on television or something? And I really have to say that I don't have any feeling at all. It's sort of like a movie that's just going on, and whether I watch it or not, it's just sort of going on. I was recently in France and was meeting French readers and French reviews and literary journalists. And what they had to say about my writing was some surprising in a way it would be astonishing to me. But it just seems like part of this whole world, a kind of affable sort of nightmare in a sense in which we're a figure, but we're not really autonomous. I really felt that the recent movie Dream Scenario with Nicolas Cage was dramatizing some of this sense of unreality. Did you see that movie?
No, I didn't.
Have you heard of it, Dream Scenario?
I haven't even heard of it, no.
It's a very conceptual movie, and in a ways it's a really philosophical movie, but it's also very contemporary. So I've seen it twice. I noticed it did not get a lot of attention. But that phenomenon that there's a self that's supposedly you, sort of out there in the consciousness of the world, and you don't identify with it, and you can't control it. I really felt that was a representation of at least my own ontological position.
Well, one last thought on the translation stuff. One of my favorite poets, Anna Akhmatova, I encountered her work in one volume of translated poetry, and the two poems that I have in mind that I love so much are, I believe, called The Song of Our Last Meeting and Three Things, and I just loved them so much. But then I encountered these same two poems in another volume with a different translator, and I just despised them.
Oh.
And it's just so interesting to me how I don't know if she is my favorite poet, or one of my favorite poets, what role the translator plays, because I don't have access to the Russian. And I just imagine that if my work, or if I were a writer and my writing were being translated into other languages, I would have some anxiety about this. But I get that having been in this world for so long, it just might kind of wash over you.
That's fascinating. I once wrote a story maybe 25 years ago called The Translation. And it was about that subject, that a man is traveling in East Europe. For a while, John Updike and I and Bill Styrian and Edward Albee and a few John Ashbery, we were sort of like ambassadors, I guess you could say, from America. We were traveling in Europe for the State Department. And John felt pretty much the way I did too. Anyway, the story is about a man. It's not about a woman, but a male writer. And he meets his translator. Let's say it's Hungarian. And she's just a very, very attractive, very warm and wonderful person. He really identifies with her. And she is his translator. But then she disappears, and he's got a new translator. And it's a man, a sort of a young, kind of a suspicious, not very friendly man. And the translator is translating his work, the writer's work, which is something very different. The idea is that we only know one another in a sense, in the terms in which we present ourselves to one another. It's like we're all performers and actors or translators, and you're getting to meet this person. Like, say you met Robert Frost at a certain point in his life. He's so nice, so gentle, so interesting. You're just like a saint. But then you meet him somewhere else, a couple of years later, so he's to an in-law. He's horrible. It's like he's the same person, but there are these multifacets of the personality. But that's very interesting about the two translations.
Do you know the Frost poem? I believe it's called "For Once Then Something."
Well, I probably do know it, but not just from the title.
I'm sure you do. I don't know. Maybe it even came up in our last conversation, but I've talked about it before. But the premise of this poem is he's like a child looking deep into wells, and at the bottom of a well, something glimmers, and for once then he sees something. And it's just interesting to me that we present ourselves differently in different situations, but then we also kind of don't really even know who we are, and we might finally see a glimmer of ourselves in our poems or something like that.
Well, Frost is a very good example of a person who became really calcified by fame and was almost like in the straitjacket of a lull he created for himself. Mark Twain also, the public Mark Twain. The private Mark Twain was very different. But when Robert Frost gave a reading, and I heard him a couple of times, he presented himself as this New England sage. Like this wonderful, like a wise old man, and he would recite his poems in this sort of oracular but sort of dreamy voice, and mesmerizing, really quite wonderful. He was playing a role. He was performing a self. I think Walt Whitman did the same thing. Charles Dickens did the same thing. There's something about a person who's maybe intensely private and secretive even, going out into the world with a persona. And I guess philosophers do that too. And I think of all the philosophers, I feel most emotionally and maybe intellectually connected with Nietzsche, because he's so much like a poet or a diarist, like a journal keeper. His aphorisms are so profound. But the more you read of Nietzsche, in a way, the less you know of him, because he's so elusive.
I'd like to finish our conversation today by talking a bit more explicitly about your writing and technique and this sort of thing. And when we spoke about your novel writing, at least, you mentioned that you are very much a planner rather than somebody who writes by the seat of their pants, and you go for these long bike rides or walks, and by the end of this period you almost have your novel written before you've even started writing. And I'm wondering if you follow a similar sort of framework for your short stories, because a lot of them in this collection at least seem like they just sort of happened. Like A Theory Pre-Post-Mortem is one that comes to mind for me, where it's pretty short and it feels like you might have just, obviously there was tons of editing, things like that, but it seems like it could have just sprouted right from your mind, fully formed, whereas others, like This Is Not a Drill, seem very meticulously thought out and crafted.
Well, I think the difference from story to story, sometimes you have the whole story in your mind as sort of like a shape. Sometimes it's more like you have the beginning. You have the definite, strong beginning, and then you have an ending, but you're not really sure how how the two get together. I wish that I had the brain power to completely imagine the novel in my head pretty completely before I started writing it. I think that Hitchcock claimed that he had a whole movie in his head, and he didn't have the note cards, or he knew exactly what the movie would be. And then he would cast actors like cattle to act out what he was doing. Yeah, it seems like that's a little mechanical, but it works, when you have a kind of effervescent live acting, the actors, the performances are so good. It doesn't feel like puppets. But with my writing, it's so much about voice. So this is not a drill. It's from the point of view of a man, like a middle-aged man who'd been a high school teacher, and he's quarantined in his house during COVID, during an epidemic. And it's at a time when the epidemic's just raging and we don't even know what's going on anymore. Many municipal buildings and services are shut down. The Wi-Fi is off and on, the power is off and on. People are told not to leave their houses because there are the National Guards out there not letting people come out. So that was basically an extrapolation of my feeling during COVID. I should say that much of this is written during the COVID quarantine when I was in the house. So I had a sense of being beleaguered and besieged and kind of trapped. And a lot of the stories are trying to find a way out of some box-like situation that one is in. Like the story Zero Sum was, to me, so exciting to write because I took some stories from real life. A philosophy graduate student, a young woman, who is very, very private and very reticent. She's not used to other people. She doesn't really feel comfortable. She's a brilliant student. She's admitted into the graduate seminar of a very distinguished philosophy. And this is a story that's based a little on Ernie Laporte telling me about Quine and Hazard and how he's related to his family. So my story takes us into the mind of the graduate student, but also takes us into the mind or minds of the family of the philosophy and how they know him or experience him so differently. It stayed in my mind, and I think it's in the story probably. My father was the person who had dinner with us, quote. And I just thought that was so profound. Like it could be Einstein. It could be Tolstoy. This great person was someone who had dinner with us. But that's all I know about it. Well, the ideas that are distinctive for these geniuses are so rarefied and so inaccessible to most people that their own families can't begin to understand them. And living here in Princeton, I was surrounded by people who are brilliant. And if they're in fields like mathematics or philosophy or physics or neuroscience, I was married to a neuroscientist for 11 years. I know that there is no way that even an educated, well-intentioned person can understand what they're doing. You can think you understand. If Oppenheimer is explaining the atom bomb to you in simple terms, you can think that you understand it, but you don't really understand. So that story, Zero Sum, was about that, to me, extraordinary phenomenon of being intimately close with somebody whom you never know. And then by the end of the story, the young woman has lost her autonomy. The story is in somebody else's head, the wife's head. We start off with the girl, and then we lose her. She's lost, and somebody else takes her place.
A couple of things. I mean, I loved that story, Zero Sum, not least of all because it relates to my life. But you mentioned Einstein's name, and Einstein comes up in the story in an interaction that I found very funny. The philosopher's daughter asks the student if her father is a good teacher, and the student laughs and says something that's like asking if Einstein was a good teacher. Who cares? It doesn't matter. He was Einstein. And I really liked that. But you also mentioned this idea of wishing that you could have a novel like fully fleshed out in your mind before you started writing. And earlier in the story, early in our conversation, you also mentioned Cervantes, and I mentioned Borges because he comes up in The Suicide. But I've mentioned this story on the podcast many times. Pierre Menard, author of the Don Quixote, but one that I haven't mentioned that seems relevant now that I really love is, I'm not sure if it's called A Secret Miracle or The Secret Miracle or A Hidden Miracle, but the story involves somebody who is summoned before a firing squad to be executed, and all this person wants is the time to finish their great novel. And in the moment after the guns are fired, time stops for the person. He has a year just inhabiting his mind, unable to move, where he writes his perfect novel. And then when it's finished, the bullets just kill him. And I just love that story. And it reminded me of what you were talking about.
That is fascinating. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, there's a whole story about Borges. I mean, the whole world of that kind of writing, that kind of conceptual writing, which is very philosophical and sort of paradoxical. It's like, he would probably say, well, I couldn't write any other way. Like maybe he would like to have written best-selling novels that were family sagas, multi-generation novels. There are things that we do that we can only do that. We can't do something else. That's why Samuel Beckett wrote very differently from his mentor, James Joyce, because he really couldn't do what Joyce was doing. It was a diminished kind of work, but it's so much brilliance and intensity into it that it becomes almost equal, these Joyce. But I wanted, before we say goodbye, in the zero-sum story, there's a philosopher who is quite brilliant, and he does his work. His work is all that he really cares about. His teaching is something he does, and he sees people, but he goes in his study, and he's working on something. That is the most important thing in his life. Nobody else can do that but him. So when he's teaching, he has a kind of bemused sort of Buddhist, I think I may read it, Buddhist detachment to the experience. And he says to the students, I don't care at all about grading. It doesn't matter to me at all what grades you get. So I'm not going to grade you unless you want me to. But I will give, if you agree, I will give everybody the same grade, which would be an A-. And each one of the students is just indignant and like well, pride has been ruffled, They know, well, they don't want all to get an A-. They want to take the course, do the work, and be graded for themselves, because there's the hope that they'll get an A or A+. So how would you feel in that situation if your professor said that to your class?
I'd be perfectly happy to take the A-.
Well, I don't know what to say about that, because you would. I think most people, I guess if grades don't mean anything. But I think a really, say Wittgenstein's in the class. Wittgenstein says, no, I don't want an A-,
mm-hmm.
because I know I'm smarter than you and I want an A+.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it is debatable. And of course, in my story, none of them want the A-.
Mm-hmm.
But then the girl's going to get the A- anyway.
There is one last thing that I wanted to ask you about before we finish. And it's one thing that you just do that it seems like you're unable to do otherwise. And what I have in mind is your descriptions are just unlike any other writers that I've encountered. And in this book, what jumped out at me, one particular description was in This Is Not a Drill, where it's something like, one morning the sky was moistly red as the interior of a lung. Or in We Were the Mulvaneys, too, that jumped out at me, where somebody's walking up the stairs with the gravity of a stone, like sinking through dark waters. Or then a light is coming through a window in a church and it falls on the ground like a golden net. And I could imagine myself being in a situation like, I've been in that situation so many times, but I've never thought that this is what light looks like. But of course, this is exactly what it looks like. And I just found myself wondering as I encountered these descriptions, whether or not you have some major artistic talent as well. You just seem so visual the way that you describe, like you're really seeing these scenes.
Oh, that's such a nice question. Yes, I'm very visual. I love to memorialize the world. I really love to replicate the world. I'm very happy when I'm describing fields and skies and houses and cats and people. But like the interior of a lung, that was particularly relevant to that story because it was a time of COVID. I'm not sure that I put COVID in the story, but it was an epidemic. People were having respiratory ailments and dying. So the idea that you'd be projecting your interior malaise or anxiety out into the world is, is very appropriate. And so too with all those descriptions that it's the perspective of the individual is coloring the world that we see.
Joyce, I mean, this has been absolutely terrific. It's such a pleasure to get to speak with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon, hopefully. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me.